Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Title IX Insider. We have Amy Watson joining us again. This is her second appearance. We just love communicating and speaking with her about all things under the sun that relate to Title IX, sexual violence prevention, prevention education. And Amy, I would love for you just to kind of remind folks who you are and all about your organization, and then we'll jump into the topic of today.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for having me again. As you say, always lovely to talk. My name's Amy. I'm the founder of HASSL, which is a social enterprise focused on tackling violence predominantly against women at the root across the world, especially by inviting men to be part of the conversation. So our kind of mission is all about redirecting the responsibility for women's safety away from women as individuals and onto society as a whole, whether that's through inviting men to be part of the conversation or working with different organizations, brands, etc., to, yeah, essentially create prevention initiatives rather than focus on kind of women doing more to stay safe. So we do it through a combination of training, on free online resources. We have a global advocacy program where there is a section specifically for men. So we work very closely with lots of men across the world, and yeah, we have lots of different initiatives, but we are a year, almost 18 months since I started building HASSL. So we are kind of over time, we keep launching new initiatives, and we're just trying to essentially have that one core mission of redirecting that responsibility, but coming at it from every angle possible, to create change. So yeah.
Great. Thank you. And we're so happy that you're back with us today, especially this month for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, because it is such an important month where folks are reminded about the intricate responsibilities we all hold in preventing sexual assault, what we can do as bystanders, as individuals to help support many women, because the truth is, usually the victim is a female. And as Amy just stated, I love your organization because you all focus on the fact that over 90% of the time, perpetrators are typically men. And so the responsibility should be falling on men. And how do we look at that? How do we respond to that? How do we address that? And so, Amy, your work is amazing. So, thank you again for joining us here today. And so, for this month, we wanted to discuss the Epstein files, which I know has been around the globe discussed with arrests taking place overseas, not necessarily here in the United States, and discuss how that really impacts the work that we do and how we see things. And so
Yeah.
my first question to you is when people hear Epstein, they think of one individual, but from a prevention standpoint, what should we actually be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think so important because like you said, I think people attach, especially because he's obviously named in it and that's how we're kind of framing it. It's an entire network of people that are not just perpetrating the behavior, but even if they're not directly causing, you know, are not directly kind of sexually assaulting people or, doing God knows what. It's people who are enabling it. There are so many people who have to have known that this was happening that did nothing. And I think this lends itself to like that wider prevention method that, people say, oh, well, you're not going to necessarily stop violent people from being violent. And of course, that's true to an extent. If, there's certain things that, I believe you can do for intervention, especially from a young age or even like rehabilitation. But even if you're not going to prevent those who perpetrating the harm, there's all these other people, as we talk about a hassle along this scale, that to some extent enabled it, whether it was knowingly or even sometimes unknowingly. But if they were better equipped, better informed, the people kind of lower down the scale that might not have necessarily known they were doing that, they would have been able to spot harm easier and been able to do more to intervene. But also everyone else down that scale who has enabled the behavior, even if they haven't directly caused harm. And obviously, this is a very serious example of enabling harm to occur at like, a huge scale, as we've seen. And there's so much else that plays into this, of course, with power play and all this kind of stuff that, we so often talk about perpetrators essentially as kind of these loners on their own in the kind of basements. And there's all this whole narrative, especially, in films and in media, that they're the only kind of people that cause harm, when in reality, so often it's the people right in front of us that are in positions of power, that, front and center of everything, it is where actually so much of this harm takes place. So it all lends itself into also the whole mission of trying to rewrite this narrative around how we see sexual violence, how we see perpetrators. Yeah, like there's I think there's so much of it that brings to light kind of the wider problems in terms of how we look at sexual violence, not just how we prevent it and intervene.
Right. I think it's fascinating many times when individuals are saying not all men, which I think we both recognize it is not all men.
Yeah,
We definitely know that. We definitely are aware of the instances where there may be false allegations as well. I know in the Title IX space, what Title IX Consulting Group, what we work in, there are false allegations that do come up.
yeah,
And at the end of the day, the thing I always remind folks is we want due process. That way, both parties, the complainant and respondent, are both going through a process of adjudication in order for us to find out and discover, was it a false allegation or did it indeed happen? And what should the consequences be for when something does occur? And so due process is such an important aspect for Title IX.
yeah,
But when we speak about globally, like the Epstein files, for example, we're talking about behavior that is rampant, that we are seeing is a system, that we are seeing is definitely a problem that primarily men are committing and doing it to females, to young girls. And so when in that instance, it does remind us about Title IX. Because
yeah,
when we look at deviant behavior, whether it's the most egregious,
yeah,
even to the lighter form of sexual harassment, lighter forms of sexual deviance, it's all going to be similar where we need to take action. We
yeah.
need to address it so that it doesn't escalate into the most egregious level. And so, my next question to you, Amy, is how do we move men from passive awareness to active accountability?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to it, because I think firstly there's so many men, unfortunately, that aren't even really in the passive awareness stage. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're an awful person, but I talk about this a lot. Women are conditioned not to talk about this stuff. We're conditioned to blame ourselves or pretend it didn't happen, or it's become so normal that we don't talk about it, or we might talk about it with female friends but not necessarily the men in our lives. And that's not always because we don't trust them. Sometimes it's because we don't want to worry them, or, as I say, we've normalized it so much that we just don't talk about it. So I think there is firstly this gap in awareness, where there is a significant amount of decent men who would care if they were more aware, but are simply just, because it's not their lived experience, because they don't have to think about it every day, and because women are so conditioned not to talk about it, they're just not as aware of what's actually happening, of not just what it's like to experience it and to deal with it afterwards, but even how much we have to plan day to day to navigate staying safe in a way that they don't have to think about typically. So I think that's the first part is, people say, oh, awareness is a bit fluffy and all this stuff, but actually there is such a gap. And I've seen that firsthand from working directly with men, how many men just genuinely are, you know, or from as much as I can tell, are very genuine, decent human beings, but just weren't aware of how bad it really is, of how much it impacts our lives from being so young, kind of say like from being 10, 11 years old in school uniform. In the UK anyway. I know you don't necessarily have uniforms in the US, but it's those core memories of women from being, as I say, barely at school and experiencing that happen. So I think there's so much there in terms of like that awareness gap as a starting point, and this is why we try and do things that kind of meet people at different parts of that scale, right? But then there's also the men who do care and are aware, but there's this fear, which I think is common for anyone of privilege, where they don't want to feel as though they are speaking over or getting it wrong when that's not their lived experience. And a lot of the time, and there's no, I have nothing against it necessarily, but there's a lot of, women's safety organizations or whatever that are just done with men over it. There's no way to change them. And I appreciate where the sentiment comes from, especially if all your experiences in life are only negative with men, which unfortunately is very common. That it does feel like there's no hope. And I get that. But for me, I feel like there was never really a place where it was like, okay, this is designed by women based on women's lived experiences, run by women, but it's all about men doing the work. You will get like male allyship organizations and stuff. Again, amazing, no disrespect, but a lot of the time they're kind of working on men, but there's not that kind of crossover between like, okay, women's lived experiences, women leading, but men doing the bulk of the work, and just actually giving them the tools to do things day to day, not the policy stuff, not the all of that's really important, especially at an organizational level. But how as a dad can I navigate this, or how can I, go into my workplace and just as a colleague be better? It's not really about, following policy is one thing, and that's really important, but it's also what does that actually look like day to day in terms of small steps. And, a lot of the men who have joined us have kind of said, I've just never really felt like there was a place where I want to help and I want to do better and I recognize it's a problem, but I just don't want to get it wrong. And sometimes it feels easier to do nothing than to get it wrong, which I think a lot of people who have privilege feel. And yeah, to me, I feel like this is kind of how every social issue should be tackled. It's not just women's safety, that different things like that. And it is often, a lack of education or a lack of understanding lived experiences. And if we can kind of bridge that gap, which is what we're trying to do, then I feel like we can move from kind of this men versus women mentality to kind of everyone versus perpetrators. And that's the aim for us anyway. And I know you also share that that goal. So yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, we definitely do. And I think that lived experience is so important
Yeah.
and it's always a big missing piece. I know that for anyone out there listening, wondering what does that mean exactly for women and for girls, it means experiencing sexual harassment early on from even an uncle, from a neighbor, from a teacher, just looking at you up and down, staring at you. It means stories where I've spoken to individuals, my own past as well, just um, attempted abductions, where people can get away and fight back. Um, it includes individuals that have been molested, meaning raped by a grandfather, where other siblings in the family have also experienced that too. And unfortunately, then it's almost like you have a target on your back because then you behave a little differently around individuals, uncomfortable, a little bit more vulnerable. And deviants tend to almost smell that in individuals.
Yeah.
And then you begin to have this almost thread of experiences over a
Yes.
lifetime,
Yeah.
especially when you've experienced it early on. I mean, I've spoken to countless women, girls that from early on to then teenage years to their 20s, to their 30s, 40s, 50s have experienced multiple points of sexual deviance and types of behavior, sexual assault, sexual harassment. Um, and it's just repeated. And understanding lived experiences, I think, is so important. And yet it's so hard because then individuals unfortunately have to share those stories.
Yeah.
And yeah,
And I think as well, like there's so many, you know, I think a lot of men, and maybe this is more of a male thing, but kind of look at it quite logically. Okay, so I mean, again, I don't need to tell you, but they'll come to me and say, or we have it in the comments where it's like, well, if I got catcalled, I'd like it. I'd like to be complimented. And there's so much like, and obviously that's the kind of one of the lowest forms, if you want to say, of sexual harassment, but it's so easy to look at it objectively and go, if someone gave me a compliment as they see it, I would be flattered. And it's like you're not that, but that isn't it isn't the reverse. That's not the reality because you've not had, and then, that's what we need to go in and explain the nuances. It's not always just about like actual personal experiences, but it's like what it's like to be a woman, and to say, yeah, you might like it if it's a one-off from someone that you have more power in reality over. It's very different, firstly, if a man says it to a young girl. It's very different as a woman who's probably experienced it time and time again, being like, that's another thing to add to my thing. It's also another thing that you're constantly navigating your safety. So when someone says that, you're not thinking, oh, that's a compliment. You're thinking, what do they want? What are they going to do next? You're not thinking, oh, the last time someone complimented me, then they followed me home, or then they tried to do X, Y, and Z. And there's just so many different parts to it. It's not, so often. And I genuinely think sometimes it is from like not a bad place, but it's just thought of in such like a logical way, and not actually understanding that it's not even just about that one action, it's about everything that feeds into that. And what we know as women, typically like a man can overpower us if we're in a situation like that can often happen. They don't have to think about that same power dynamic. As soon as you kind of say, well, if a man you know complimented you that you didn't know, they immediately, a lot of them are like, oh no, I wouldn't like that. And that doesn't even bring into account any of like the power dynamics, lived experience, anything. So it's that gap of understanding, like it's not just, like you said, telling stories and things like that is so important. And obviously, like you said, women are unfortunately more susceptible to kind of end up with men continuing to do that pattern, because I mean there's so much that goes into it. But it's unfortunately, you can end up kind of being in those situations time and time again, especially if you've already been worn down by one before. um
Mhm.
and it is that gap of like just the human side of it, just like actually being like, okay, just imagine, like, from being a child, men were shouting, from being a child, like we sometimes flip it. I'm like, from being a child, women were shouting at you out of cars from being in your school uniform, women 3 times your age. Then every time a woman spoke to you, like half the time they then tried to follow you or tried to get something out of you, or they buy you a drink and then they spike it or whatever. And then there's this whole thing. And then it's like, to add to all of that, there's also, even if it was flipped, it's still not flipped because there's not necessarily the power imbalance, there's not the patriarchy, there's not all of those aspects. So yeah, there's just so much to it. And obviously I don't need to tell you, but I think this is a kind of a key area where we almost need to strip it back to basics a bit. It sounds quite simple, but there's just this basic lack of understanding of what it's actually like, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I have to wonder, how do we get more women to speak up where
Yeah,
it is expected of us to speak up, share our stories, share what's happened, rather than it being the exception?
yeah. Yeah, I think there is this kind of general consensus that I do agree with, that it's like it's always been put on women. It's always been put on women to like speak up and educate men and do X, Y, and Z. And I think a lot of women are exhausted by it, which I totally understand. And I think it's more about um, creating a space that is where you can speak up, because a lot of the time, people don't speak up because there's so many barriers to doing so, not just the people around you not believing you or judging you or whatever, but there's we see so often there is so many repercussions from like a career perspective, from friend group, from people get raped and then their partner says, oh, you cheated on me. Like there's just so many barriers to talking about things that
Mhm.
have happened, right? And I think that's the first thing, is like why I think it's so important that we focus on societal stuff, is that if we don't create spaces where women can talk about it, where they feel like they're not judged, and where they don't also feel like they're doing the work for the benefit of others, like they're bearing their soul so men will care. Like I think we have to start really, you know, focusing on men in society, creating those spaces where it's most likely to be met with acceptance and understanding and care and not judgment. One of the courses that we have in our library is like for men, about how to open up conversations about harassment with women in your life. And it's not, to go and dig into deep dark trauma, but it's even, watching a campaign video and saying, oh, like, and we give them like pointers on this, and it's like, going, oh, watch this campaign video. It really made me think, do you mind sharing if that's something you can relate to? And that's just like safety tips, like very surface. That's not digging down into stuff, but it's just trying to start opening up those conversations. And, you know, it's so easy for people to want to like justify it or say, oh, but it's not that bad or whatever. And it's trying to give them the tools to be like, but that's not what you say in that situation. You have to create space, because at the end of the day, you don't want to be the reason why a woman in your life doesn't tell you what's happened to her, because that you've got such a powerful position. And it's even little things that we talk about, like, you know when you see a news story. I mean, Epstein could be an example, although I feel like in the UK, at least, I feel like the majority of people, believe it, at least. But it's how do we talk about cases even in the media and stuff? Do we dismiss the women who are speaking out? Do we talk about them negatively? Because that could be a passing comment to you, but to a woman in your life that's been through something, that's another thing on her list that's like, I don't know if I can trust that person. And I
Mhm.
think that's where we have to create like that safety and talk about it. And also as a society, like we've still got so far to go in terms of the way that we put blame, like the media puts the blame on the victim, or the way that we talk about, the conviction rates being so low, all that kind of stuff, the way that reporting is so difficult. It's kind of, I don't blame anyone for not reporting or not speaking up, because everything's against them doing that. And I think people who do are absolutely incredible, so brave. Epstein survivors, for example, like the things that they did was incredible, like how terrifying that must be, and the power dynamic, and all the threats that people had to family and all this kind of stuff, and the fact that they still did it, all of that was just incredible. And I don't think people necessarily appreciate how much of a feat that is to have been able to go through all that. So yeah, I think it's very much about trying to, as I say, I think for so long there's been a focus on like women speak up, women do this, women do that, and all of that's very important, but you have to give them the world to do that in, right? Like
Yeah, that's right.
otherwise, yeah,
Yeah, I think, with the Epstein files, the Epstein story, the fact that it's the system that is and has been working against individuals that
yeah,
have suffered and have been harmed. It's very parallel to what we see every day with the justice system. I mean, the FBI is involved, right, with the Epstein files as well. So there's all these parallels to the individual stories that we've heard over all these decades, and then the Epstein files blows up, and it's an example of the system again,
yeah,
just re-victimizing everyone that has survived, because obviously there are victims that did not survive,
yeah,
victims that were murdered, victims that were killed
absolutely,
because of all of this.
yeah,
Um, and so it is very scary to think about the fact that, yes, lived experiences are important to share, but many times those lived experiences can cause additional harm if they're shared, right? We
yeah.
don't
And a
want
lot
to
of times,
disclose, but
yeah, re-traumatized, like it's bad enough going through it, and then a lot of the time it's people say that's sometimes the worst part is the reliving it, the court system, all that kind of stuff. It's not set up to to encourage you to do that in any way. So yeah,
yeah, I think that's like the biggest fear, the fear-based part of it
yeah,
for individuals. I know I've spoken to so many females that say not is it just the justice system that doesn't believe them, but also sometimes other women.
yeah,
Other women
absolutely,
won't believe what females have gone through because they haven't experienced it themselves. Which,
yeah,
I'm happy to know that there are many women that have not experienced it. That's a blessing,
yeah,
whether they realize that or not. Because I think the reality is most females have experienced some form of sexual misconduct, sexual harassment, sexual assault.
mhm,
And for the women that have experienced it multiple times in their lifetime, those are the women that I think will be the most helpful in a lot of the work that I think that you're doing in addressing men specifically, because then it's not just a one-off or men believing, as you said, logically, well,
mhm,
if it happened this one instance, maybe it wasn't that bad.
yeah,
Um, I think logically men, you're right, think very logical to the extreme,
Mm.
where it is harmful for them to then step forward and be a bystander or step forward and stop that deviance with other men around them. Um,
Yeah, and I think like you said about women, I mean, that's why we kind of say, men, we focus on men, but it is that we have to meet everyone where they are because there are still so many women, like you said, who victim blame or who don't believe or have some form of internalized misogyny. And I do talk about it a lot, and I think part of it is like a coping mechanism where it's kind of like if I can say that happened to her because she did something, that means that it won't happen to me because I'm careful or I do X, Y, and Z. And I think you know, and I think there's a lot of women who have experienced it who just won't even acknowledge it or don't want to talk about it or have convinced themselves. People do that with trauma, like they bury it so deep because they don't want to believe or they're not ready to process it or whatever. And so I think that's also part of it. I think women have a lot to unlearn with conditioning and all that kind of stuff. And women also enable behavior and not necessarily always to the same extreme, but
mhm,
there's still more that
mhm,
everyone can do. And I think that's why it is like an everyone problem. Everyone sits at different places and everyone's got different levels of stuff.
mhm,
Different distances from, full advocacy, if that's what you want to call it. But yeah, absolutely. Like, and also women, parents raising young people and all that kind of stuff. Like the more that everyone can unlearn harmful norms, we can raise the next generations better and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think everyone's got work to do, definitely. Yeah.
absolutely. And what you just stated makes me think about individuals going through domestic violence, also
Yeah.
dating violence, but mainly domestic violence. And when I think about women that are in denial,
Yeah.
um, because they go through this honeymoon phase, right? And they believe to begin to believe that things are going to be okay and they're really not that bad. And so this sense of denial really is strong in the minds of women and men that are going through domestic violence because they want to believe someone is better than what they're seeing. So they
Yeah,
don't believe their
absolutely.
eyes, they want to mask in their minds.
Yeah, and perpetrators are good at it. Like it's one thing they know how to do is, manipulate people into self-blame or like you said, it's not that bad or this is just how relationships are or whatever the narrative is. And yeah, I think a lot of the time it is a coping mechanism, especially for women. Like you said, I think I'm yet to come across a woman who doesn't have many stories, not just one. So, I think for those who say, well, it's never happened to me, I'm not saying that there's no one out there that it's never happened to, but I think, it's very, I think so much of it is that kind of, like you said, like that denial kind of
Mhm.
mentality or just buried it so deep and don't want to process, can't process it. I mean, it's a human reaction, but
Absolutely. I was speaking with a friend of mine. We were having lunch a couple months back, and we were talking about what we do for a living and whatnot. And she's a doctor, and she mentioned that it had never nothing had ever happened to her. And I thought that was very interesting. I said, really? I'm
yeah,
sitting there and we're kind of discussing and describing what sexual assault is and sexual harassment. She's asking questions and, I'm just kind of freely answering things, softly on surface level. And then all of a sudden she says, you know what? I think maybe I did experience something once and I just never really processed it. And I said, well, what was it? Do you mind me asking? And she said, "Well, I was walking down the street and she's voluptuous. And she said, I was walking down the street and I was at a street corner and a man just came up and just grabbed my boob and just felt her up.
mm,
And she just pushed him off. And she said that she never thought about it again.
yeah,
And she just kind of went about her day. And then in that moment, as we're discussing it, she says to me, would that be considered a sexual assault? And I said, yeah, that is, because that is your personal space, that's your body. And obviously, he's touching you in a sexual manner, and you didn't consent to that. And so that is considered a physical assault, a sexual assault.
yeah. I mean, we get it all the time where people message us and say, oh, I think I was harassed. that I'm not sure. And then they'll say what happened, and I'm like, you weren't harassed, you were assaulted. Like that's not even you know what I mean? And it is that, especially for younger girls. I mean, not just younger girls, like everyone, but I think growing up, you're so conditioned to be like, oh, that's because he likes you, or but you know, like whatever. And yeah, it's actually they don't even realize that that's what it is. And it's something we do in like the training a lot is we talk about examples rather than calling it like sexual assault, sexual harassment, because a lot of the time people don't pair like the real life scenarios with those terms. Because again, we've the way that we talk about it and the way that we've been conditioned and all this kind of stuff. And you know, we'll go, have you ever, like you said, have you ever been touched by a stranger that you didn't consent to, or have you ever been shouted at in the street, something sexual, or you know, we'll go through those kind of examples, and everyone's like, yeah, of course I have. Like everyone's just there, you know, and then it's like, okay, so no one in this room has not experienced it, and then it's kind of this. I feel like it dawns on a lot of people that oh, you know, because when people don't like to label this stuff, and it's again, it's a self-preservation thing. Um, People don't like to be seen as a victim because of all the stigma against it. But, you know, the more that we kind of pretend it's not happening, it doesn't stop it from happening. It just continues to happen because no one's doing anything about it. So I remember one time we did training and this woman came over to me afterwards and she said, oh, I only joined because I have a daughter and I just was kind of seeing if there was ways to help her. And it's made me realize all this stuff that I experienced that I'd never even thought was that. And now it's like, and she like gone from not even really thinking about it to like signing up to be an ambassador because in the space of like 3 hours, because she was just like, I really was genuinely just coming to this to be like, how do I help my daughter basically? Like if she has to go through, in case she goes through anything. And it just changed her whole
Mhm.
perspective. And she was kind of, she was really upset actually. And she was, you know, she basically just said, I hate the fact that my daughter's probably going to have to experience this. And I was like, I know it's confronting, but also the more that we recognize it and the more that we talk about it and the more that you know how to deal with it, the more that if I'll say when it does happen, that she can talk about it and that it can be processed in the best way and all that kind of stuff. And she doesn't blame herself because you're not pushing, oh, it's on you to stay safe and all this kind of stuff. And I think that's the thing. It's confronting and it's hard for people, but it's also like by ignoring it or pretending it doesn't happen, it doesn't not happen. It just means that more people suffer. So as much as it's difficult, it's like it's the, in my opinion, it's the lesser of two evils. You know, we talk about it or we don't, basically.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think as we're discussing this, I'm wondering what is it that men listening to this right now should walk away thinking about immediately?
I think I think trying to take a step back from your own reality, and we always kind of say like just listen. It's really easy to hear things, but to like genuinely listen and actually think, really put yourself in someone's shoes and really understand what it actually must be like. That's the difference between just hearing and be like, oh, that's sad that that happened to you, or that's not great, or you know, the classic reactions of, oh, if I knew a man that did that to my daughter, whatever, I'd be out there. And it's like, firstly, that's often a reason why women don't tell people they care about because they're afraid that violence will then ensue, because that is quite common where men are like, I'm going to go after that person. Um, but also, it is just really like listening to what that person needs in that moment. It's not about you as much as you can be angry and that kind of stuff. It's not about you, it's about the person who went through that. And just really like being not pushing things, but just being a safe space for someone to come to when and if they are ready. But yeah, I think like if someone tells you a story, even like your brain might immediately go to like they're not telling the truth, or oh, it's not that bad or whatever. Just like actually listen to what it's like and just be there. And if it's a colleague, if it's a family member, whoever it is, it's so easy to jump into that either angry mode or into that doubtful mode because we've been conditioned. But try to take that step back and just really hear what happened, what it's like, what they wish to do, how can you be there for them? Those kind of things can make such a difference to women in your life.
I love that. Thank you for that. I think that's the best piece of advice to walk away with, in this conversation. So I think for today, we're going to wrap it up here. Amy, just thank you so much for joining again today. Everyone, please like and subscribe to us. Leave a comment, leave a question if you have any. I will be watching. Amy will be watching as well. And Amy, again, just thank you. Any final words you'd like to say?
I don't think so. Just if you are wanting any further help with any of this, we have free education resources, so you can go on, use them wherever you are in the world. If you want any more guidance or to better understand, yeah, the reality, really, that would be my only takeaway.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, and we'll see you at the next one. Bye.